Hi, everyone. Happy Saturday. We are here with Chris Belcher, who wrote what month is it? January, February, March nonfiction pick, Pretty Baby. So everyone give her a warm welcome. We are so excited that she's here to give you a bit more information about Chris. She's a writer, professor, and former sex worker. She completed a PhD in English at the University of Southern California, where she now teaches writing and gender studies. Under her working name, Natalie West, she edited the acclaimed anthology We Too Essays on Sex Work and Survival, which is going to be an upcoming pick for our nonfiction polls in the future for Sapph-Lit for sure. Born and raised in West Virginia, she now lives in Los Angeles with her partner and two orange cats. Welcome.
Hi, thank you so much for having me. Thank you for reading, supporting the book, and also just being in lesbian and queer women's lit worlds. It's really great to see communities like this, like supporting artists and writers.
Thank you. Well, first of all, congratulations on, I guess you could consider this your debut since you wrote every single word of this book. What has the publishing process been like for you, and how did that experience differ from that of We Too?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, it was a similar experience in the sense that, while this is a memoir, it is for me it's a political act as well. It is a book that is not only about coming out and being queer, but also about sex work and about the stigma that I faced as a sex worker. And when I originally conceived of writing the book, it was, I was kind of going on the job market and I wasn't able to really focus on the fact that, all of my accomplishments and my research and all of these things, all I was thinking about was, are people going to find out about my past?
Mm.
And I ran from that for quite some time. And then I finally got to the point where I was like, you know what? I'm not going to edit anthologies in my working name. I'm not going to hide anymore. I think that I need to like embrace this in a full-throated way. And I guess a memoir is probably the most full-throated way that you could do that. But I wrote the book because I wanted to free myself from the closet, and I also wanted to do work that other sex workers and other like sex working academics would be able to kind of, see and like see that I haven't lost my job and, I'm just in a different place because of talking about the book. And so, yeah, the publishing process for me, it's when you write a nonfiction book, you write a proposal and then you have like a year to write it once you get a book deal, which is very quick. I did it over the course of the pandemic. I wrote it in 2020, and so yeah, that was my publishing process.
Yeah. You kind of answered my next question, which is, talking about that process of being in academia and having this secret. And now that secret's out, you're teaching where you got your PhD, and you kind of said it, you're coming out of the closet a kind of second time. So I'm wondering how did that compare to your original coming out experience, do you think?
When I came out, I guess in the book, if you've read it, you know that I came out, or I sort of was pushed out of the closet when I was a teenager. Um, and I think that, that process, if you're not part of a really supportive family or a really supportive community, and you're a minor, you depend on those people,
Yeah.
right? And so it was frightening in a different way. I mean, certainly I had concerns about losing my job, but I would find another job, you know? So I think that, it was an even more vulnerable coming out process. And I think that coming out can be really, really vulnerable for folks who don't know that they're going to have support systems for doing that. And so my second coming out, I was the adult. I was able to make the decision. It wasn't forced upon me, and it was scary, but it wasn't vulnerable, I think, in the same ways.
Yeah. How do you feel now having, this book has been out for a while? I'm sure you're kind of settling back into work. How do you feel, better with this secret out? I don't want to call it a secret because kind of secrets have this negative connotation. Do you feel
Right.
better, living in your full truth and having your past publicized in this way?
I do. I've had moments, especially because I am still teaching, and I'm really excited that I've had students who've read my book, who've bought my book. I mean, that's amazing. It feels really supportive and lovely that that's been able to happen. But I mean, like the book is incredibly intimate, and everything from like the loss of my virginity to the first time I did sex work to like very like strange and disorienting experiences I've had in sex and sex work. And so, I have to kind of not think about it in some
Yeah, you
way.
really
Like,
went into the deep end. You were like, this isn't
yeah,
just a factoid that here is my entire life served to you on a silver platter. It's so
yeah.
vulnerable.
I mean, but you know what? The thing I try to remind myself is I'm not the only one having these experiences, not only in sex work, but just the kinds of intimate, vulnerable, sometimes disturbing, sometimes violent, and sometimes like incredibly joyful and lovely experiences around sex and sexuality. I might have written about it, but I know that a reader is showing up to the page having had their own set of experiences that might not mirror mine. But I do think that, this a lot of this book is about shame and the kinds of shame that is especially heaped on women and girls. And I was experiencing that kind of shame around sex and sexuality from the time I was a kid or in middle school or like coming of age. And I know that I'm not alone in that. And so I think that that helps, right? When I have a student come up to me and say, like, I read your book, like the initial reaction is like, you know so much about me, and I don't know that much about you, which is it's a very particular kind of power dynamic. You write a book and you might feel like, okay, like I've accomplished this thing, like that's really wonderful, and it is. And but on the other hand, you've given folks so much knowledge about who you are, and you don't have the same thing about them, which can feel very strange. But I guess at the end of the day, I'm comforted knowing that like while I may have given a lot of myself to a reader, they also show up at the page with their own stuff.
Yeah, I mean, that was definitely the experience for me reading this book. I was also a gender and sexuality studies major. That was my academic career myself. I worked for a sex toy company throughout all of college and wrote my thesis on vibrator design. So reading this, I got so much out of it personally. And one thing that I wonder is I came out 3-ish years ago. And, in thinking about that coming out for myself personally, being a gender studies major, I feel like I intellectualized it, and
Mhm.
that made it so much harder to do the thing because I was like thinking about like, oh, if I tell my family this, they know XYZ. And I had studied so much about coming out and coming out narratives that I definitely used my academia to distance myself a bit from my own. And I'm wondering if in your academic experience and in your studies and research, did you use that material to intellectualize your own doming experience to kind of distance yourself from it or justify certain things? I know you get into that a bit in the book, but would love to hear a bit more from you.
Yeah, definitely. I had a lot more power over my own narrative, I think, as an adult coming out as a sex worker. For me, when I came out as gay or as a lesbian in high school, which is how I thought of myself, even though, yeah, again, I didn't really come out, I kind of got outed. But um, at that time, I think I was confronted by the fact that the people around me had this idea of what lesbian meant that came from pornography primarily. Honestly, at the time, I can't, this was like 2002. Like, certainly there were like queer filmmakers who were making really interesting work, and Ellen had had a kiss on TV. Um, but the community that I was in, there were very, very few queer women, and I do write about them in the book, and I owe them a lot of. I'm grateful that they were in my life in some way. Um, but I think I was coming from this point in time where like internet pornography about lesbians was like everywhere. Like I discovered, you know, that my dad, like I saw on like the search history of my computer, like family shared desktop, that my dad had watched lesbian porn before I came out. And so like I knew that I was like, you know, outed into this world that had very specific ideas about me. And I think that that was really hard. So, like, coming out, I thought, I guess, you know, to me, it was like everybody is thinking something about the way that I want to have sex or my desires or my fantasies. And that was like quite humiliating for a teenage girl. um, when I when I came out a second time as a sex worker, you know, certainly like all of that comes with it, right? There is so much stigma and people make assumptions about the kind of person you are and like what you will do for money, and like they might think, you know, I wouldn't do that for money, so you're a different kind of person than me. And that's also it was also like a difficult thing to come up against. And I think, you know, I talk about in the book, like, you know, I'm coming from gender and sexuality studies and queer studies and queer theory. And there's a kind of way that folks who are working in those fields can intellectualize what's happening, but oftentimes you'll have like the academic who's watching somebody do the things that they again like might not be doing, like folks who study things like public sex cultures, for instance. You know, they might be writing about cruising in bathhouses in ways that like, you know, that they've been there and you know that they've seen it, but they don't talk about themselves.
Mm.
And so there's a kind of like intellectual distance there, or, you know, people who write about artists who do really radically queer work that might have to do with like having sex in front of people or talking about sex in a particular way. But the person who's writing about it oftentimes isn't doing that themselves. And I think that, you know, queer theory and queer studies and feminist theory, like those fields are changing, and I think that there is more acceptance of, you know, the person who's doing that writing like participating in these cultures. But I also think it's because like other writers are paving the way and people are like making space for that kind of work. um I'm sorry, this is a very long-winded comment.
No, don't say sorry. We love tangents here.
I'm gonna finally get my way back to your question, which is like, did I intellectualize the doming? I think at first I thought, well, this, you know, these experiences that I'm having, like I have this theoretical framework that I've gotten from school that I can think about power in a particular kind of way. And that makes like what I'm doing somehow different, like anthropological or something like that. But that faded away really quickly when I realized that the things that I were learning in the dungeon actually were quite informing like the ways that I was seeing the classroom. The kinds of like power dynamics that mark academia, where, you know, a graduate student, for instance, is is entirely dependent on her advisor. You know, in or like there's it's a kind of subservient relationship in some ways. It's a relationship where you have to like prove yourself, prove your intellect. And if that person decides that they don't want to work with you or that your work isn't good enough, like you can't move forward. I think you know, I was very lucky that I had an advisor who was supportive and was you know, kind of open to understanding the place that I came from. She's also working class, and we sort of came to academia in the same way. But I, you know, like there are other people who I know who are sex workers who, you know, did so much academic work and then their advisors found out what they were doing and they want nothing to do with them. And your career kind of stops at that point. And so I think in through BDSM and in the dungeon, I learned about power and power dynamics and power exchange in ways that were actually much healthier than that. You can call it off at any time. It is play. You know, it is something that everybody is agreeing to in a way that I think, you know, going in what it's going to be. And I don't think that that's the case in a lot of ways in academia, and also I'm sure in other fields. I mean, that's sort of where I work, but anybody who's has like a kind of relationship to a person in power in their work, we know like through the We Too movement, particularly over the past 5 years, how damaging that can be. And like most people don't agree on those power dynamics. They just show up to them.
Yeah. Well, thank you for that answer. Yeah, every time I have these author conversations, I want to immediately go back and reread the book. So that was like an answer that made me want to go back. And speaking of We Too, I was doing some research on the anthology, and I noticed that in your Natalie West bio for We Too, it mentions that you moonlighted as a sex work, BDSM, and queer community authenticity consultant for film and television. I'd love to hear a bit more about that experience and know what your work on set and what that input did to the roles, to the scenes, to the film as a whole.
hmm I mean, it usually happens in a pre-production moment, right? I think there are really interesting people. I'm very interested in the like burgeoning field of like intimacy coordinators or people who are on set, like negotiating some of these power dynamics that I'm talking about. But I think the work of consultants or people who are doing authenticity work going into like reading a script or like working with producers are really, we've had like as long as there have been films and TV about sex work, there have been bad representations of sex work. And it's not as if those things still don't happen. There's like, I mean, I don't know how famously because like I don't think it got well, it got 2 seasons, but there is a show about a dominatrix
The one on
that
Netflix?
yeah, the one
Oh
on
my God, I
Netflix.
know. Yeah, I never watched it. I just watched the trailer and I was like, this is bullshit.
Yeah, it was really hard for me to watch because it's not like representations like that can like on the one hand, and I think that people in lots of like even if you're like, you work in a symphony and you watch Tar, you might be like, wow, that's not the way it works, and that's one thing. But I think when it comes to marginalized populations and folks whose work is stigmatized, there can be real harm done when a good number of people watch a film or watch a TV show and then think that that's the way it works. And so, like that kind of work of like having folks who are doing like authenticity work reading a script beforehand and kind of marking for producers and for writers like, hey, this is how things are working. And maybe we'll get to a point where there are like more sex workers, for instance, who are in writers rooms, or who are being able to write their own work, and like then the need for authenticity consultation will be less. But as long as people who are not from those communities are able to tell their stories, I think that that kind of work is really necessary.
Yeah, agreed. I want to shout out Shelby in the chat. Shelby said, I'm doing my PhD right now, and oh my God, never even considered the power dynamic. If the PI cuts you off, you literally lose so much, not to mention funding or access to other experts in the field.
Yeah, yeah. And again, it's like it's not necessarily a consensual power dynamic, and it's not one that I think there are a lot of safety elements in place to
Mm.
make sure that that doesn't happen. And so, like those are things that I would love to see change. And I'm not in administration at the university, but I imagine if my career ever moved into those directions, I don't know it will, but if it ever moved into those directions, I would love to do more advocacy work for folks who are in positions of like either adjuncts or graduate students, and like there are folks who are doing that work at universities, but I think that there needs to be more emphasis on it.
Yeah. So switching gears a little bit, I loved how you wrote about femininity in the book, and I was really interested to understand how your relationship to femininity and masculinity has shifted since retiring and what your current relationship is with gender expression. And what was that process of kind of re-regulating and getting back to, I think, homeostasis, or like what's your new normal? I do have to say your hair is goals for me personally. I have like super, like straight hair, but I love a bang. I have like a bit of a shag tied up right now, but yeah, what feels right to you? That's, not you playing a character.
Yeah. Well, I will say that my hair texture changed as I got older. So I don't know. My hair probably looked more like yours when I was in my when I was in my 20s, and then with age it somehow changed and got curly. Um, I so it's funny. Like I always thought, and I think, and I wouldn't say this to challenge anybody else's relationship to gender. But when I was younger, when I was coming out, I think I thought of gender as something that was very much an expression of my truest self.
Mm.
Um, and and I think that a lot of people do feel that way. As I've gone through these experiences of having to like make my gender very transactional, because in sex work, and this is a kind of generalization, but I think that, femininity sells in a particular kind of way. And in my book, I talk about really kind of confronting that. Like, I had a more masculine presentation. I do now today. I identify as a long hair butch. So, and that's like some of that is more of a like state of mind, I think, than necessarily what you look like. Um, but I wasn't very feminine, and I had to learn how to do that. Like I had to learn how to be feminine in order to make money in this particular field. And so I started to see gender as transactional in a certain sense. The performance of it became not just, something that we might know that like gender is performative, that we like choose to do it. It's not something innate that comes from within us, but is like, and which is not to say that it's authentic, but I really started to feel the performance of it in a very acute way. Um, and then after that, I guess I sort of, kind of looked back on my life, and I felt like even those like authentic moments of gender presentation or performance were also, like transactional in a certain way. Like I will put on these particular clothes or cut my hair in a particular way in order to find a partner, right? Or to be recognized as queer. And like that's messed up too, right? And we know that like femme
Yeah.
invisibility is a problem. And I think that folks are negotiating that in lots of ways all the time. But kind of, as you said, like getting back to homeostasis, it has also been difficult for me because I I've gotten a particular kind of power out of femininity. You can move in different ways. You can, for me, you can make money in different ways. You can move undetected through spaces with like cis het men who treat you who treat you differently. And I think in academia, for instance, I would say the opposite is true. Like putting
Mm.
on masculinity has a kind of, carries with it a kind of authority.
Yeah.
Again, all of these things are, like, I don't know, aspects of what I've experienced of gender that don't feel good, but feel like something I'm very aware of. And so I think, kind of getting back to like being able to be the long hair butch, right, that I want to be. I just have all of that knowledge that I kind of carry into it, for
Yeah.
better or worse.
When we had we do Zoom chats, just the club of the books that we read. And I forget exactly who said it, but they phrased it, gender performance is currency. And
Hmm.
that really stuck with me. I was like, I want to embroider that on a pillow or something,
Hmm.
like dedicated to Judith Butler. Um, but also something that I've been thinking about with my own personal gender expression and how I dress. I'm very femme and often kind of venture into that hyper femininity. And I think especially with Gen Z and TikTok, there's been a kind of rise in this hyper femininity that is so repellent to men. Um, and I see femininity as so queer, and that kind of femininity is so queer. So I think within femininity, there's also this line between, the male gaze femininity and then, um, that kind of hyper femininity that is like drag and super bubblegum and very performative, like even more visually performative and kooky. This is kind of a half-baked question, but um, how did you know when you were going into the dungeon what was the acceptable kind of femininity? Take a shot every time I say
Yeah.
femininity.
No, that's a really good question. And I think that, I do see, especially because like I'm 38 years old, but I'm in contact with Gen Z daily because I teach people who are, anywhere from like 20 to 22, basically, or maybe even like 18 to 22. So um, I register that. I haven't heard it put in quite those ways, but I register it like by thinking about my students. Um, I think in professional domination, there's an archetype,
Mhm.
right? It's not even, I don't think that, and people, like there are people who who are queer people who have careers in sex work, who are able to like embody a kind of like authenticity in their femininity or whatever their gender presentation is that I wasn't necessarily able to do. Like for me, it was here's the archetype. I know what it looks like. I know what she wears. I know what her makeup looks like. And unfortunately, some of that, and I talk about in the book, I had this relationship with a fetish photographer who was manipulative, abusive, a blackmailer, like, a revenge porn artist, right? Like
The
a
woat.
very bad guy.
Yeah, the woat, the worst of all time.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. And so he kind of taught me in a way, right? Like this is what men want, this is what they want to buy. And again, like that sort of femininity was transactional in the dungeon. I think I learned about, like I put on like 6-inch stiletto heels in the dungeon, and I sold it in a particular way because I knew that was the archetype and I could embody it. But I did then leave the dungeon and enjoy those things in queer
Yeah.
spaces. Like if I wore that same pair of boots into like a leather bar on like a queer women's night,
Mhm.
I could take that archetype and do it with other people, and it didn't feel the same. And so, I think that all of these things are contextual. If you think about the kinds of like hyper femininity that might be repellent to men, I think if you're also pointing that and signaling that to other queer women, it is something that can be desirable, right? And so, and maybe even the like rejection of like the like cis het male gaze like becomes what's attractive about it, right? Like, and so I think, yeah, I guess I had an archetype, I knew how to perform it, but it wasn't necessarily the femininity that I was performing in my own life.
Yeah. I love that answer. Wow. Okay, cool. I'd love to know you kind of mentioned this a little bit in the book, but I'd love to know your thoughts on how the sex work industry has changed since you retired. We now have OnlyFans, and as you mentioned, there are lots of sex workers who use social media as a way to connect with their clients. And I'd love to know, in your estimation, how would that current landscape affect you both financially and mentally, also considering SESTA FOSTA and sex workers' sense of power online is being, taken away?
Yeah, when I started doing sex work, which is in 2000, around 2012, um, there wasn't this expectation around social media. And so you could I mean, those are the reasons why I could do the work and be in the closet. I think it is very, very difficult for folks now today to do the work and be in the closet. It has to be a more, open embrace of what you're doing. And in some ways, like platforms like OnlyFans have given folks, a kind of control over some of their content, but overwhelmingly what again, like hear from my sex worker friends who are still active, and then of course, like just like engage with like politically online and in activist circles, is that there's a lot more fear now about things being taken away. Like I did have an experience kind of early on in Venmo before we sort of like understood that these platforms were, controlled by people who were not us. Where a client had paid me and I did the work and I got my Venmo seized and I lost like $1,200. And when you do that kind of labor and like your money can just disappear because a company can tell that you're doing sex work or that you have like suspicious activity and your money is just gone. It's a real wake up call. And so like folks who are doing sex work that's very dependent on these social media platforms, and tech platforms, it's scary, right? Because like you don't at the end of the day have control, oftentimes, of your image, right? That gets replicated and circulated on platforms like Pornhub. You don't necessarily know if your bank account is going to stay stable and be there for you, or you're going to be able to like do work where the financial transactions are supportive. And that's really scary. That's really vulnerable. It's precarious. And I think a lot needs to change in those regards, to where like the kind of the means of production would be held with the workers who are doing sexual labor. FOSTA SESTA changed everything. That was so if you don't know about that law, it was passed during the Trump administration, but that's not to say that it was entirely conservatively backed. There were many, many Democrats who were behind that law, and I think that is something that we need to think about and hold folks accountable for. But it made it so that a platform that was hosting like a post, for instance, that would be illegal, they could be held liable. They could be held legally liable for what happens on their platform. And so before, you were able to like go on Backpage, for instance, and put up an ad for domination. You get emails from clients, you could vet them, you could talk to your sex worker friends and ask if they've seen that person. And it was it was just like an online, it provided a platform, but also a safety net for folks, to do a lot of their scheduling and booking themselves online. So when that was taken away, folks could work, for instance, for agencies, or things could go more underground, or you could try to do the work on social media. But again, like that comes with all kinds of problems of its own. And so, if I wanted to, and I've advised folks today, like, people who want to get into pro doming, and I would just say like it's so different from when I did it. And you know the law was intended to, like, quote unquote, protect folks who have been trafficked, and that's a whole other conversation that I don't think is necessarily pertinent to this question. It hasn't worked. In short, it hasn't worked. But you know it yeah, I don't know, it completely changed the landscape. I don't even know how to tell people to do the work now, because when I was doing it, it was different. It was safer. There were a lot more precautions that you could take that you can't today.
Yeah, those internal structures that sex workers built themselves to protect themselves and their friends and others in the industry were completely ripped away. And with
Yeah.
Backpage shut down, that, I sex worker friends of mine and those online that I follow, it was heartbreaking to watch that breakdown, because there was like a panic of like, oh, what do you do now? And then that was also kind of happening when OnlyFans threatened to, shut down the like like the porn and nude side of their site, which doesn't make any fucking sense. But yeah, kind of related to that. One of the most interesting parts of the second half of the book for me, and you talk a lot about it, is what you call the whore hierarchy. And, for those who maybe haven't finished it yet on the call, it's, a sort of pyramid or hierarchy of sorts where the street sex workers and those who are doing, more shameful kinds of sex work, are at the bottom, and then you move up and you kind of have doms and those who maybe don't feel like they're not having sex with their clients are at the top. I'm explaining this poorly. You do it very well in the
No,
book.
no, that's good. I mean, I feel like that, and like the hierarchy, as I saw it when I was actively pro-doming, had to do with how much intimacy you have with a client, or like how much contact you have to have with a client. And so, at the time when I was doming, I put doms almost at the top because overwhelmingly, pro-doms don't have like they don't have quote unquote they don't have sex with their clients, which is really a kind of complicated thing for a queer person to say, because like queer
Because then you're pegging
people.
them and like, isn't that sex?
Right, right. It's hard to define what sex is, but like in
Yeah.
a traditional heteronormative, I
Cis,
would like to say
straight.
peen in vagine, like let's say like
Yeah.
that kind of sex. Like if you don't have it, then somehow you're like higher on the hierarchy. But I would say like now the what I see, like just like by talking to my students and talking to other folks in my life who've never done sex work, I think that OnlyFans might be like the top
Yeah.
of the pyramid now.
That was going to be my question, is like, where do you put those how does social media affect that hierarchy? Because I mean, those are, if you kind of relate it by contact and who has the most sense of intimacy with their client, social media and that parasocial relationship, there's no physical contact most of the time, to my understanding.
Yeah.
Um, and I'd also love to know, to those workers who are more at the top of the hierarchy now, what are some tips or things that you would tell them to go about investigating their own role in the hierarchy and maintaining that hierarchy? Who do you look for to do that work?
I think, and I see Shelby's comment in the chat about the intimacy of those parasocial relationships. And I think that absolutely. I mean, you're like, again, it's like in terms of like contact, like, I could give an hour of my time and then I could leave the dungeon. Like in the book, I do talk about, like ways that the dungeon followed me out, and some of those ways were really problematic, but like to have to give so much of yourself, also to have your image online and like that could be replicated and distributed in ways that are outside of your power. My parents couldn't see what I was doing in the dungeon, right? But if I had an OnlyFans, they could, right? And so I think, it's complicated and it's not cut and dry.
Like a
But I
matrix
think,
now. It's not like top down. It sounds more like there's physical intimacy and then there's emotional intimacy. And then there's maybe like another bisect that's like privacy. Um,
mhm.
and where you fit on that, um, determines. It's kind of like this charmed circle, but charmed matrix of sex work.
No, totally, totally. And I talk about, a client like toward the end of my book where I'm thinking about, he seems to have so much power to like access his sexuality and his fantasies. And what I realized is that it's not that he is so open-minded or open to those things, it's that he just has like the power to purchase privacy, right? And like I think when you're selling sexuality, oftentimes you're giving away that power. And yeah, again, I mean, all of those things I think, factor into the hierarchy. And I would just like mark out for those who are listening like this was actually the hardest thing for me to write about because it's a kind of one of the ugliest parts of myself that I like bought into that. And that I allowed it to kind of keep me going and doing the work. And I think that it's really harmful. The power dynamics are very harmful. The people who are at the bottom of that hierarchy are oftentimes lacking safety in lots of different ways. And so, I wrote about it because I had to make the story true. But I don't I mean, I advocate for its dismantling. I think that folks who are sex workers, who are doing things like OnlyFans, for instance, or who are pro-doming, like need to kind of understand that their privilege can allow them to maybe do work that could bring up those who are in the bottom of the hierarchy or destigmatize that work or, just provide basic levels of safety by like, working against, condom laws or like loitering laws or the things that like often put those workers who are at the bottom of that hierarchy in real physical danger. And I think that, like that is one thing that, the sex work umbrella is very large. You know, it can like encompass folks who are doing like street-based work and folks who are like camming, but because of that I think we can draw on the strength of that to say like those who have more power, those who have more privilege, like need to be doing the work and kind of like seeing like, okay, I'm part of this community, like how can I advocate on behalf of all of us.
Yeah, I love that. Yeah, when I was reading it, I could tell that it was like hard to talk about. And one of the because I mean you have to do like a lot of internal work, I imagine, to write a memoir where it's like, oh, am I going to tell this version of the story? Am I really going to dig deep and do this version? One of our community members had um a question about your writing process, and she wanted to know, her name's Olivia, was it emotional for you to like how much of that work was done before you started writing and what work was left when you began the process?
It's funny. I think it's even ongoing. Like I can't say that I like, somehow like even became the authority on my own experiences in some way. It's funny because I got a new therapist after after writing this book,
Love.
and we were talking about like some patterns in my own life that when I figured them out in therapy and like literally the book was already written, I like look at the book and I'm like, oh, like I didn't even realize it at the time of writing. And I hope that I don't think that makes the book better or worse, but I hope that what it does is serves as an inspiration to younger writers. I was like probably 35 when I started this process, which is not, obviously there are some people, that's why we have like 30 under 30. There are people who are doing work when they're much younger. But I think that other people feel like I can't write about my experience until I've gotten distance from it or I've like fully understood it. And I just like don't think that's true.
Yeah.
I think that you can, in terms of my own process, like, yeah, I figured out things about the experiences I was writing about as I was writing them. It wasn't like I understood it and then went back and wrote it. And I think that that's probably like present in the book itself because I don't think I really tried to withhold the sort of like authorial, like authoritative narrator who is like yeah, I don't know. I mean, it's like you kind of like move through the book, I think, as scared and unknowing as I was at certain moments. And I think that's okay. There's like also not at the end of the book, there's not like a triumph narrative because like I don't really know what the end of that story is.
Yeah. I mean, you're still writing it and we're
Yeah.
constantly in progress. So I love that perspective. Okay, wrapping up a few more of my personal questions. Sorry, I have so many. And then we're going to move on to the rapid fire round. And for those who are on the call that have questions for Chris, drop them in the chat box and we'll ask them if we have time at the end. Um, all right. So you talked about how in your relationship with Catherine, which was a very interesting relationship to read about, it kind of, to me, showed how queer, like lack of queer community in growing up can kind of propel you into toxic queer family dynamics. Don't know if we have time to talk about and unpack all of that, but I'd love to chat about how you talked about that in your relationship with her, since you were both doms, the lines between what was real in your relationship and what was performance were blurred. How did you distinguish between the two post-retirement and in relationships since her?
Yeah, I'm in favor of what we call like the homance, right? So like two sex workers in love, like
I love
there's
that.
nothing more beautiful, yeah. Because there's a kind of understanding of experience. But I think, in that particular relationship, for me, it got blurry. Not because we were both doing the same work, but because there was a resistance to turning it off. Because turning it off meant turning off the money, even for a night. And that was hard, because again, it's like, especially like if you are, like if you are like queer, if you do want to keep like, heteronormativity out of your bedroom, like inviting men in those ways, I don't know, for me it was really difficult, and I can't speak about what others experiences are. Again, we're talking about like platforms like OnlyFans, where you have to give up so much of yourself and you have to be on in different ways, like almost all the time. And that was very difficult for me, to kind of navigate. And it wouldn't be for everybody. I think that some people probably can like move between those things, but I had, a lot of baggage over like, am I like losing my like lesbian identity through
Yeah.
like all of this contact I have with men? And so for me, it was difficult.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, moving on to rapid fire round. Short questions, short answers, but if you want to go on a tangent, go for it.
I'll
Um,
try. I'll try.
what are you currently reading?
I am currently reading X by Davy Davis.
Ooh, I haven't heard of that one. I'll look it up. What is a book that you recommend everyone to read
Oh
besides
Lord.
Community?
Um, Sula by Toni Morrison is one of my favorite novels.
Agreed, me too. What is a book coming out soon that you're excited to read?
Um, oh my gosh, I don't know the title, but Marissa Crane has a new novel that I'm
Oh, I keep
reading.
my exoskeletons to myself.
Yes, yes, yes,
Yeah,
yes, yes.
yeah, that's one of the Sapph-Lit potential poll picks
Oh,
down.
fantastic.
If you could have dinner with anyone dead or alive, what would it be? Who would it be?
I was like, what would the
I
dinner
was like,
be?
what?
Um, oh man, if I could have dinner with anyone dead or alive, what would it be? Maybe like Simone de Beauvoir. I don't know. I mean, I would probably go for some like feminist theory. Yeah.
Yeah, I love mine's a similar answer, but more modern feminist theory. Betty Dodson, who,
Mm.
yeah, Hitachi Magic Wand pioneer. Look it up for those on the call who don't know who Betty Dodson is. Icon. Favorite class you took at university?
Favorite class I took at university. I think I took a class on like Marxist lit, when I was an undergraduate, that really kind of changed my view on like what culture could do in the world. Yeah.
Favorite queer movie and or TV show?
Hmm. Queer movie or TV show. What am I watching right now? I mean, I'm watching a lot of not queer stuff. I'm watching like literally Love is Blind like everyone else.
I was literally gonna
Um,
say I'm watching Love is Blind as well.
I mean,
Veronica
I'm
and
just
I were
gonna,
talking about it before.
yeah, it's hard not to. I'm just gonna go with a classic and say, But I'm a Cheerleader. That's probably one of my favorite
I've
movies.
never seen it, which is like so tragic. And
Do it this weekend.
yeah, that's my Easter weekend. Veronica, Nina, what the fuck? No, I agree. I've been saying I will watch it for years and I still haven't. Favorite queer celebrity or content creator person to follow on social media?
Oh my gosh, this is so funny because I with my students, again, like I'm millennial, my students are Gen Z. We just did like a queer culture poll in my class, and I did so poorly because all of their stuff is like
Wait, so
is
did they come up with the questions and
they
you had
came
to
up with the questions, and I was bad at them because a lot of it was like TikTok.
Mhm.
I really like making queer history, working class history on Instagram. I'm not even on TikTok. Like I'm
You're
on
not on
TikTok.
I love that for you. I often wish I wouldn't be on TikTok, but Sapph-Lit wouldn't exist without TikTok. So
I know. I'm very happy that it does, and I keep saying I'm gonna try. But for now, Instagram. But yeah, like working class history is a really fantastic
I'll check them
account.
out. Okay, so we're gonna open up to chat questions. And if you have any questions for Chris, drop them in the chat. I have more questions that I haven't asked. So while we're waiting for chat questions to pour in, I'm gonna ask a few more. You mentioned at one point in the book that you attended a sex worker support group. Can you share more about that?
Yeah, it's actually the final essay in We Too is about that group. It's called Hooker's Army. And it's a peer support network. We actually trained in self-defense.
Oh,
For those who maybe have experiences with self-defense, oftentimes those classes, like the mainstream ones, can be racist, classist, like this sort of like imagined stranger like popping out in a bad neighborhood, and like,
yeah.
don't walk alone at night in a bad neighborhood, like all of that kind of discourse that can be, really alienating to sex workers, especially if
I
like,
took one of those.
yeah, yeah. I mean, if you're walking alone at night because like that's the work you're doing, like that, it's not going to be helpful to you. And it can be very like slut shaming and victim blaming. So Hooker's Army is a group where we engage in self-defense that is like actually useful for sex workers, and like has to do with things like how do you run if you're wearing heels, right? Like how can you use like your body as a weapon to get yourself out of situations that might be like more intimate and where you know the person. And so yeah, that was what that group was.
Yeah,
But we also did like boundary negotiations, and some of what I talk about in the book is like how
love
to like disengage with a client.
I love that. That's amazing. Jesse asked a question. I'm so glad that she did because I didn't have time to add it to my own questions. Do you think it is possible for a woman to be truly dominant over a man in patriarchal society, or does the service slash product mindset of doming naturally inhibit true dominance?
I hope that the final chapter of my book answers this question. It is like ambivalent, but that is what like I tried to answer at the end of the book. Um, for me, the answer was no. For me, but I think that that also has to do with the fact that I didn't necessarily desire men, even in a submissive position. And so I could have fun with it. I could make money doing it. I actually quite enjoyed it in lots of ways. But like, do I feel like I was really able to step into my like true dominance? No. Do I think that other women are able to do that? Absolutely. Like I can't, like for me, like, you living in patriarchy affects different people differently. And so there were like I couldn't in a fantasy space ever step out of that, or I couldn't let the fantasy space be as real as I might have liked. But I don't know that that's everyone's experience, and yeah, I don't want to give a blanket yes or no. But for me, the power dynamic was always so present in my mind that I wasn't able to completely give over to the fantasy.
Yeah. This is another question that I pulled from our community chat ahead of the interview from Olivia as well. Would you have gone into doming without Catherine's influence?
I mean, I don't know, I think that there is something, and my relationship with Catherine was not always the best or healthiest, but I do think that there's something wonderful about queerness where, we're thinking about sex differently. And I think that we have different ideas about, what you can do for a body, what's shameful, what's, like all of those things that I think there is a sort of like way that queer people can open each other up to sex work and those possibilities as a way to like make money and survive. That I don't know, it's possible that I would have like just through queer community in LA and the kinds of people that I'm around and know and cherish. I guess it's possible that I would have, found my way into sex work. But and in the book I talk about I did have an earlier experience of sex work that was also introduced by a girlfriend. And so, you know, I think that kind of points to like, I'm willing to follow a woman into like God knows where, but
You're like, I'll do it for
yeah,
love,
yeah,
romance.
yeah, exactly. And just like money, I mean, like the money, it's like I
I mean,
was
he had
like
to pay
really
for
looking.
school. Yeah.
Yeah, I was like looking for ways to make money, and so like perhaps I would have found my way there anyway.
Yeah. All right. So last question that I'm really glad I get to ask. Is there a reaction from a reader or someone that has reached out since this book published that has stood out to you as like a like in a good way moment?
Yeah, I had a reader who was a student of mine who told me who wrote me and told me that, she was doing cam work while she was in my class and felt so alienated at the university
Yeah.
from like, like what her peers were doing, how they were getting money, and how she was getting money, and that she didn't know it at the time, but that my class felt like a safe space to just like explore. And we didn't like she didn't write about sex work in my class, um, but she did write about her feminism, and like that to me was just like a really like wonderful email to receive. Also, my guidance counselor in high school wrote me an email, and she just said like, I didn't know that any of this stuff was happening. I'm so sorry, like I would have
Oh,
tried harder. Which was, sorry, I'm getting like choked up a little bit, but that email is really healing in a way.
oh my God, I love that. Yeah, that's amazing. Of course you're getting choked up about that. I'm getting choked up about it. Um, Okay, before we wrap, I do want to share that I had a funny experience while reading this book. I had surgery last month. Everything's fine. I got my tonsils removed. And I was reading your book in the pre-op room. They allowed me to bring my phone and a book, and I was reading Pretty Baby, waiting for over an hour for my surgery. And my surgeon walks in and he's like, "Ooh, what are you reading?" And he grabs the book out of my hands and starts reading the back. And I was like, "I run a book club, and this is this thing, and this is what it's about." And I always, explain what I'm reading because I often read atypical things for the general public in
Yeah.
public. And he takes a moment. He's like, I operated on a dominatrix once, and she was so nice. And I learned a lot that day. And he handed me back the book. So yeah, that was just a funny experience I wanted to share with you before we go.
That's
Um,
amazing. And well, here's the thing, like I feel like sex workers are, and this is why we can just learn so much about sex and boundaries and consent and all of these things from sex workers, is because like I think you do the work and you have a very specific kind of relationship to your body. So I imagine like talk like somebody who has done sex work or is a dominatrix talking to a surgeon, great conversations you can get into,
oh,
I'm sure.
yeah, I'm sure. I would love to have been a fly on the wall when he when he discovered that. But anyways, Chris, thank you so much for chatting with me, chatting with our community. I had a wonderful time learning more about you and everything about Pretty Baby. So yeah, I just can't wait to see, where you go next, and hopefully we can reconnect in the future.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much, and thank you to your community. Like this is really lovely, and keep up the good work of like circulating queer books and promoting queer writers. It's really wonderful. So thank you so
Always.
much.
Yeah. Have a wonderful rest of your weekend, and yeah, see you online. Bye, everyone.
See ya.